The corridors of Ashton High were lined with polished trophy cases and photographs of smiling, well-groomed students, a gleaming facade of success and promise. To any outsider, it was a beacon of excellence. But those who walked these halls every day knew that beneath the shining surface, there were cracks. Invisible fissures of prejudice, of silent cruelty, of unspoken hierarchies that determined who was seen and who was invisible. And perhaps no one knew this better than Ruth Carter. Every morning, before the sun fully rose, Ruth pushed open the heavy side door and entered the school she had served for nearly 20 years. Her uniform, navy blue, starched but worn, blended into the walls. Her broom and mop became extensions of her body. She was a shadow among the golden youth of Ashton, cleaning up after their triumphs, wiping away their careless messes, collecting their forgotten things, and, too often, their discarded respect. The students barely glanced at her. A few, emboldened by ignorance or cruelty, muttered under their breath as she passed. The teachers, caught up in their worlds of achievement and pride, offered polite nods at best, suspicion at worst. In their eyes, Ruth Carter was not a person with a past or a soul with dreams once set ablaze. She was a fixture, like the clock on the wall or the rusted lockers, necessary, invisible, and beneath notice. What none of them knew, what none of them even imagined, was that Ruth Carter had once dreamed not of scrubbing floors, but of solving the mysteries of the universe. Numbers had once sung to her, formulas had once been her playground. She had been a rising star, a mathematician whose mind had danced through calculus and complex theory as easily as others breathed. But life had other plans. Plans forged in hardship, discrimination, and heartbreak. And Ruth had folded her dreams into a small, aching place deep inside herself, a place she never touched anymore, for fear the memories would burn too brightly. Until one morning, everything changed. Until Mr. William Prescott, young, proud, and unkind in the careless way of men who believe they own the very air they breathe, handed her a piece of chalk with a smirk curling the edge of his mouth. Until he said, loud enough for every student in his elite Calculus 3 class to hear. "Since you've been hanging around my lessons, Ruth, why don't you show us your skills? Solve this one for us. Or is that too much for a janitor?" A beat of silence. Then, laughter, sharp, merciless, cutting through the air like knives. Students leaned back in their chairs, smirking. Some whispered cruel jokes behind cupped hands. Others stared openly, daring her to try and fail. Mr. Prescott crossed his arms, his eyes gleaming with amusement and arrogance, confident that he had orchestrated a public humiliation too perfect to miss. The world seemed to tilt. Ruth stood frozen, the chalk burning in her hand like a white-hot brand. Memories she had spent decades burying roared back with a violence that stole her breath, long-forgotten lecture halls, gleaming theorems, the shame of walking away from it all, the bitterness of dreams crumbling beneath the weight of survival. She could have lowered her head. She could have turned away. She could have accepted the role they had always written for her, silent, small, invisible. But something deep within Ruth Carter, something fierce, something wild, something that had never truly died, stirred. And this time, she would not bow. This time, she would remind them, and herself, who she had always been. The room held its breath as Ruth Carter stepped forward. Not a janitor. Not a shadow. But a woman who, against all odds, still carried a mind sharp enough to cut through steel, and a spirit strong enough to light the way. The first lines Hazel traced on the blackboard were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, like the first tentative notes of a forgotten song. The room held its breath, caught between curiosity and expectation of her inevitable failure. But failure did not come. Instead, the chalk moved with growing confidence, carving through the complex jungle of the equation with an elegance that no one in the room could deny. Variables untangled themselves beneath her touch. Integrals folded neatly into solutions. Abstract symbols found their rhythm, their meaning, their purpose, in the dance of her steady hand. The students watched, spellbound. One by one, the smirks began to fade, replaced by widening eyes and slowly slackening jaws. Phones, half raised to capture a moment of expected humiliation, were lowered in stunned silence. Mr. Sloane, standing stiffly by his desk, blinked once, then again, his expression tightening. His arms, once crossed in triumph, now hung awkwardly at his sides. Hazel did not glance at them. Her focus was absolute, her mind unfurling the solution with a grace and clarity that no one else in the room could have mustered. It was as if the years she had spent scrubbing floors and wiping windows had only served to polish the brilliance that had always lived quietly within her. With a final, decisive flourish, Hazel placed the chalk down. She stepped back from the board, her breathing calm, her back straight. Silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of expectation, nor the cruel silence of amusement withheld. This was a heavier silence, thick with awe, confusion, and something rawer still, shame. For the first time, Hazel turned to face them. Her eyes swept across the room, meeting those of the students who had laughed, the teacher who had mocked. Not with anger. Not with triumph. But with a quiet sadness, profound and dignified, that spoke louder than any words could. The solution on the board was flawless. Perfect. Undeniable. There was no mistaking it. Hazel Brooks, the woman they had ignored, pitied, and ridiculed, was a mathematician of rare and dazzling talent. The first sound to break the silence was a soft gasp. Then a murmur. A shifting of feet. Whispers rose like smoke among the students. She solved it. She solved it. Mr. Sloane didn't even get that far last week. Sloane himself seemed rooted to the spot, his face pale, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. His carefully curated image of superiority crumbled in real time before his students' disbelieving eyes. Hazel offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, then bent down to pick up her cart and slowly began to push it toward the door. The gesture was so natural, so habitual, it almost broke the spell. Here was a woman who had just dismantled an entire web of prejudice with a piece of chalk, and yet she returned, without drama, to her cart and her cleaning supplies, as if genius were just another item on her to-do list. But the room would never be the same. "Ms. Brooks," a voice called out, hesitant, uncertain. Hazel paused at the threshold. It was Naomi Carter, one of Sloane's brightest students. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued, Could you explain how you did that? It wasn't mockery. It wasn't condescension. It was genuine curiosity. Respect. Hazel turned slowly, the corners of her mouth lifting into the faintest of smiles. In that moment, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the very soul of Willow Ridge High School. A crack appeared in the polished veneer, letting in a beam of something new. Something stronger. Understanding. Change. Hazel stood at the doorway for a long heartbeat, her hand resting lightly on the handle of her cleaning cart. She could feel the weight of dozens of gazes pressing against her back, different now, tinged not with disdain but with an almost desperate need to understand. She had spent so many years walking invisible through these halls that the sudden burden of their attention felt almost heavier than their old contempt. Slowly, she turned. Her voice, when it came, was calm, low, and steady. It filled the room not with force, but with something far stronger, certainty. "I didn't solve it today," Hazel said quietly, her eyes scanning the young faces before her. "I solved it years ago. Long before any of you even knew what calculus was." The class hung on her words, frozen. "You see," she continued, stepping forward, not as a janitor now, but as a teacher, a storyteller, a witness, I was supposed to be someone else. Once. I was supposed to be a mathematician. I had a scholarship to one of the best universities in the country. I spent nights dreaming about numbers, about the beauty of equations, about all the ways math could explain the world. Her voice softened, growing almost wistful. But life had other plans. In her mind's eye, Hazel saw it all as if it had happened yesterday, the bitter winters walking across campus wrapped in a too-thin coat, the whispered slurs written across her textbooks, the way professors' faces would tighten when she dared to speak too confidently in class. They had called her ambitious, too bold, too proud for a girl like her. She had learned to lower her gaze. To speak more softly. To diminish herself until she barely recognized the young woman who had once dreamed of changing the world with numbers. And when the final blow came, the phone call about her father's accident, the shattering financial ruin it brought, she had packed her dreams into a small battered suitcase and left campus behind, believing it would only be for a while. A year. 2, maybe. Not forever. Hazel drew a breath, grounding herself back in the present. I took jobs, she said simply. Any jobs? I scrubbed floors. Washed dishes. Cleaned houses. I told myself it was temporary. That I'd find my way back. Her hand instinctively tightened around the cart's handle. But life isn't always generous with second chances. Sometimes it demands everything you have just to survive. A heavy silence filled the room, thick with the unspoken guilt of those who had mocked her, those who had looked through her like she was part of the furniture. Mr. Sloane stood stiffly by his desk, his mouth a thin line, his eyes fixed somewhere far away, as if he could disappear into the floor. Hazel's gaze drifted to him, but she said nothing. There was no need. Her voice softened even further. But here's the thing about dreams, she said, her eyes shining not with sadness, but with a fierce, quiet pride. They don't die just because life pushes you down. They wait. Sometimes buried so deep you almost forget they're there. She tapped the blackboard lightly with one calloused finger. And sometimes, all it takes to bring them back is a piece of chalk, and a reason. The students sat in stunned silence, their faces a mix of awe, shame, and something else, something softer, more open. Naomi Carter, still clutching her notebook tightly to her chest, rose slowly to her feet. I'd like to learn from you, she said, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. Please. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Hazel blinked, a lump rising unexpectedly in her throat. For years, she had walked these halls like a ghost. Now, for the first time in decades, she realized she had the power to leave behind something real, something lasting. Not through grand speeches. Not through anger or vengeance. But through patience, dignity, and the quiet brilliance that no mop or bucket had ever been able to erase. Hazel smiled, a small, real smile that warmed the chilled room like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. I think, she said softly, we can all learn from each other. And with that, she stepped fully into the classroom, leaving the cart, and the weight of years of invisibility, behind her. The hours after that pivotal moment passed in a strange, golden haze. Word of what had happened in Mr. Sloane's class spread through Jefferson High like wildfire, carried from mouth to mouth faster than any rumor ever could. It was not a scandal that fueled it this time, but awe. A story too incredible to ignore. The janitor, a woman whose name most students had never even bothered to learn, had solved a problem the school's best and brightest couldn't touch. The next morning, as Hazel walked through the main doors with her mop and bucket, a subtle shift in the air greeted her. It was in the way the students parted to make room for her in the hallway. In the way some of them murmured shy greetings, their eyes cast downward in what she recognized instantly, shame, mingled with a growing respect. Hazel kept her expression neutral, though inside, her heart was a storm of conflicting emotions. She had never sought this spotlight. She had never asked for their admiration. Part of her still wanted to vanish into the background, to escape the heavy weight of their attention. But another part of her, a small, fierce part she thought she had buried long ago, lifted her chin ever so slightly higher. In room 204, Mr. Sloane sat at his desk, staring blankly at a stack of ungraded papers. The chalkboard behind him had been wiped clean, but in his mind, he could still see the problem Hazel had solved, every elegant step, every flowing line. It gnawed at him. Not the fact that she had bested the students. No, that would have been almost expected. Teenagers were foolish, impulsive, and lazy with their logic. But Hazel had bested him. The man who had spent years building his identity around the myth of his superiority. And she had done it not with loud words or arrogant gestures, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove, and yet proved everything. For the first time in many years, Mr. Sloane felt a seed of doubt crack through the hardened soil of his pride. Was it possible he had been wrong, not just about Hazel, but about so many others he had silently judged over the years? The thought unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. At lunchtime, Principal Marston called a private meeting. Hazel was surprised when she received the invitation. She had never set foot in the administrative offices for anything other than cleaning them after hours. Now, she found herself seated across from the principal, a tall, serious woman with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for fairness, along with Mr. Sloane and a few other senior teachers. The room felt heavy with unspoken things. "Miss Hazel," Principal Marston began, her voice formal but kind, "first, allow me to offer a sincere apology. It is clear that you were treated with profound disrespect in a place where you should have been honored for your service, not mocked." Hazel said nothing, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Marston continued, her gaze steady. "We have failed you. All of us. Not only in our assumptions, but in the culture we allowed to persist here." Across the table, Mr. Sloane shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Hazel finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not looking for apologies," she said. "I'm not angry. I'm just tired. Tired of being seen only for what's on the surface." A heavy silence fell. It was Mr. Sloane who finally broke it. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse. "But I hope you'll believe me when I say, you've taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." Hazel met his eyes, and for the first time, saw something new there, humility. Regret. And perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of understanding. Principal Marston cleared her throat gently. "We would like to offer you a role," she said. "Not as a janitor. As part of our academic support team. Assisting with tutoring in mathematics. If you're willing." Hazel's heart stuttered in her chest. The offer was everything her younger self would have leapt at: validation, respect, a seat at the table she had once been so cruelly denied. And yet, she thought of the cleaning cart, of the quiet dignity she had carried all these years. Of how much she had learned not just through equations, but through patience, resilience, and grace. Hazel smiled softly. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "But I don't need a title to know my worth." The teachers exchanged glances, some embarrassed, some deeply moved. Hazel rose slowly to her feet. "But if you truly want to honor me," she continued, "then honor every invisible person in this school. See them. Listen to them. Believe in their worth before they have to prove it." With that, she gathered her things and left the room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. It was the most powerful lesson she could ever teach, and she hadn't needed a chalkboard to do it. The days that followed felt like walking through a world Hazel no longer recognized, and yet, paradoxically, one she had been quietly building for decades. Everywhere she went, the atmosphere was different. The students who had once averted their eyes or chuckled cruelly behind her back now nodded respectfully as she passed. Some even stopped to offer small greetings, a quiet, "Good morning, Ms. Hazel," or a hesitant, "Thank you for everything you do." The transformation wasn't perfect. Prejudices, Hazel knew, didn't vanish overnight like chalk from a board. They were embedded deep, woven into the casual jokes, the passing glances, the structures too vast for any one act to dismantle. But she could feel it, something had shifted. A seed had been planted. And in the hopeful faces of the younger students, she saw the first tender shoots. Even more surprising was Mr. Sloane. The man who had once treated her existence as invisible now went out of his way to acknowledge her presence. No longer in the stiff, performative way that often accompanied public apologies, but with a genuine, if awkward, humility. Once, Hazel found him waiting outside room 108 as she cleaned the windows. "I thought," he said, hesitating, looking almost painfully out of place, "maybe you could look over some problems with my honors students. If you'd be willing." Hazel studied him carefully. She could see the struggle in his posture, the breaking of old habits, the deliberate reaching across a chasm he had spent years widening with his arrogance. Part of her wanted to refuse, to remind him that dignity was not something she needed his permission to claim. But a deeper part, the part that still remembered her dreams of chalkboards and lecture halls, recognized the opportunity for what it was, not a favor, not an apology, but a beginning. "I'll think about it," Hazel said simply, before turning back to her work. And for the first time, Mr. Sloane accepted her answer without protest. That night, Hazel sat at her small kitchen table, her calloused hands cradling a chipped porcelain mug of tea. Outside, the winter wind whispered against the windows, stirring memories she had kept buried for too long. In her mind, she saw herself at 22, standing at the gates of Columbia University, suitcase in hand, dreams shining like stars behind tear-stained eyes. Back then, she had believed in a world where hard work and brilliance were enough to overcome anything. She had believed that if she was smart enough, diligent enough, patient enough, the world would eventually see her for who she truly was. But life had not been so kind. Prejudice, she learned, was not always a fist or a shouted slur. Sometimes it was quieter, more insidious, a door closed without explanation, an opportunity that never materialized, 1,000 tiny cuts that slowly bled a person of hope. Hazel had bled quietly for years. And yet, somehow, she had survived. Grown strong. Become not what others expected her to be, but what she chose to become. Now, staring into the dark liquid of her tea, Hazel realized something profound: the world might never be perfectly fair. There would always be doors closed for no good reason, judgments passed by shallow eyes. But what mattered, the only thing that had ever truly mattered, was how she chose to walk through it. With dignity. With resilience. With grace. And maybe, just maybe, with the courage to demand better, not just for herself, but for those who would come after. Hazel set down her mug and smiled softly, a deep and quiet smile that needed no audience to make it real. Tomorrow, she would visit room 108. Not to prove anything. Not to seek approval. But because she still believed, despite everything, that knowledge was a gift worth sharing. And that sometimes, the quietest voices carried the greatest power. The following week, Hazel stood quietly at the threshold of room 108. The advanced calculus class sat in their seats, buzzing with low conversation that tapered off into an uneasy silence when they noticed her. Mr. Sloane, for once, didn't wear his usual air of superiority. Instead, he looked nervous. Hopeful. Humbled. He gave Hazel a slight nod, stepping aside as if yielding the floor to her. Hazel crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, her faded work shoes making soft sounds against the polished linoleum. She picked up a piece of chalk, the same kind she had once wielded so fearlessly as a young student, and turned to face the blackboard. The problem Mr. Sloane had written was complex, intricate, and designed to challenge even the most gifted. Hazel studied it for a long moment. Not because she didn't understand, it was simpler than many of the equations she had memorized in her youth, but because she wanted to savor the moment. To remember what it felt like to stand before a classroom again, not as an outsider, but as someone whose mind was finally being seen. Without a word, she began to write. Each line of calculation was clean, precise, and elegant. The numbers flowed naturally from her hand, not forced, but summoned from a deep well of understanding that had never truly dried up, only been hidden from the light. Behind her, the students leaned forward, their skepticism slowly replaced by awe. Hazel didn't rush. She didn't try to dazzle them with speed. Instead, she moved at the pace of understanding itself, methodical, patient, true. When she finished, she placed the chalk gently on the tray and turned back to the class. "This," she said, her voice low but steady, "is not magic. It's not something you're born with, either." The students sat spellbound, their eyes wide, the room silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. "It's work," Hazel continued, her tone neither lecturing nor boastful. "It's love for solving problems no one else wants to touch. For not giving up when the world tells you you should." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And it's knowing," she said quietly, "that your worth is not measured by the color of your skin, the clothes you wear, or the titles people give you. It's measured by what you know here," she tapped her temple gently, "and how you choose to use it." For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a single hand raised. It belonged to a young girl in the second row, Marissa Calloway, one of the brightest students in the class, known equally for her sharp mind and sharper tongue. "Miss Hazel," Marissa said hesitantly, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it, "can you teach us?" Hazel felt something uncoil in her chest, a tightness she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Teach. The word was heavy with meaning. It wasn't just about equations. It was an invitation into something far larger, a chance to heal, to guide, to pass on the fierce dignity that had carried her through a lifetime of silent battles. Hazel smiled, a slow, genuine smile that seemed to light the dim room. "I can try," she said. And just like that, a new chapter quietly began. For the next hour, Hazel worked with the students. She broke down the problem step by step, not talking down to them, but treating them as equals, inviting them into the beauty and logic of mathematics. They responded eagerly, leaning forward, asking questions, challenging her, and challenging themselves. Mr. Sloane stayed at the back of the room, arms folded, a thoughtful expression on his face. He said nothing, but in his eyes was a glimmer of something rare, gratitude. When the bell rang, the students didn't bolt for the door as usual. They lingered, gathering around Hazel, asking for book recommendations, advice, or just hoping to hear her speak a little longer. As she packed up the notes she had scrawled on the board, Hazel caught a glimpse of herself in the window's reflection, an older woman with graying hair, worn hands, and eyes that sparkled with a fierce, quiet pride. For the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, respected, and most of all, needed. As she left room 108, the hallway was filled not with hurried steps and indifferent glances, but with polite nods, smiles, and the quiet buzz of genuine admiration. Hazel walked through it all with a calm heart, her step steady, her soul lighter. Maybe the world didn't change all at once. Maybe it didn't need to. Sometimes, all it took was one moment of truth to shift the tides, and one woman brave enough to claim her rightful place in the story. Days melted into weeks, and room 108 no longer belonged solely to Mr. Sloane's rigid doctrines. It had become something else, something electric, alive. Students arrived early, sometimes before the first bell, notebooks clutched tightly in their arms. They stayed after class, lingering with questions that had nothing to do with grades and everything to do with hunger, a hunger to understand, to reach for something higher. And at the center of it all stood Hazel Whittaker. Not as a teacher, not officially, but as a presence, a spirit that filled the room with a quiet authority deeper than any title could bestow. Mr. Sloane, to his credit, no longer stood aloof. He had humbled himself enough to occasionally ask Hazel to review his lessons, even consult her on particularly thorny proofs. His voice, once sharpened by arrogance, had softened, the edges worn down by the invisible work of transformation. Yet change, Hazel knew, was a fragile thing. One afternoon, as autumn sunlight slanted through the tall windows, she noticed a group of parents congregating in the hallway. Their polished shoes clicked sharply on the floor, their expensive watches caught the fading light. Whispers drifted into the classroom. "That's the janitor, isn't it? I heard she's teaching now. Can you imagine, our children learning from someone like her?" The word stung, but Hazel remained steady. She had known this would come. For prejudice, like mold, thrived best in the quiet and the hidden. And the light she had brought into this place was beginning to expose corners that had long gone untouched. Later that week, Principal Emerson called Hazel into his office. He was a kind man, but he wore the harried look of someone constantly balancing on a tightrope stretched taut between politics and principle. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "There have been complaints." Hazel folded her hands calmly in her lap. She said nothing, letting him fill the uncomfortable silence. "Some parents are questioning," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "the appropriateness of having a janitor assisting in advanced classes. They worry about appearances." There it was. Not her qualifications. Not her ability. Appearances. Hazel looked at Principal Emerson for a long, steady moment. "Do you think I'm hurting the students?" she asked, her voice even. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but Hazel caught it. "No," he admitted finally. "Quite the opposite. They've never been more engaged. They respect you. He faltered, clearing his throat. "They look up to you." "Then it's not the students who have a problem," Hazel said gently. "It's the parents." He nodded grimly. "I can step back," Hazel offered quietly. "If it makes your position easier." Emerson looked genuinely pained. "I don't want that," he said firmly. "But I also don't want this to become a scandal that overshadows the real progress we've made." Hazel stood up. She moved to the window, looking out over the playing fields bathed in the soft gold of a late October afternoon. She thought of all the battles she had fought silently. The dreams were abandoned. The nights she had wiped tears from her eyes and kept moving because there was no other choice. And then she thought of the students. The bright eyes. The eagerness. The hope. Slowly, Hazel turned back to him. "I won't let them bury the truth again," she said. "Not this time." Principal Emerson rose as well, something like admiration flickering behind the weariness in his gaze. "Then we'll stand together," he said simply. It was not a grand promise. It was not a guarantee of victory. But it was enough. Later that evening, Hazel sat alone in the janitor's closet that had been her quiet refuge for so many years. The mop buckets and cleaning supplies surrounded her like old companions. In her hands, she held a worn photograph, herself at 22, in a crisp blouse and pressed slacks, standing proudly in front of the mathematics building at Oak Ridge University. She had kept it hidden for decades, a relic of a dream deferred. Hazel traced the edges of the photo with a tender finger. Maybe dreams never really die, she thought. Maybe they just wait for the right moment to rise again. Outside the door, she heard the familiar sounds of Jefferson High School winding down for the day. Laughter. Locker doors slamming. Footsteps echoing down long hallways. But this time, those sounds did not make her feel invisible. They made her feel present. A part of something. And as she slipped the photo back into her pocket and picked up her broom once more, Hazel Whittaker smiled to herself. Because she knew. The battle was not over. But neither was she. Not by a long shot. Winter arrived at Jefferson High School with little warning. One morning, Hazel Whittaker pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped into a world blanketed in white. Snowflakes danced in the frozen air like tiny shards of glass, and her breath unfurled in soft clouds before her. The halls were quieter these days, almost reverent. Students no longer rushed past her with indifferent glances. Some even paused to hold the door open, offering warm smiles that, once, would have felt unimaginable. Still, beneath the surface, tension simmered. The upcoming Winter Symposium, a prestigious academic showcase, was fast approaching, a crown jewel in Jefferson's calendar. For decades, it had been reserved for the brightest students to present research and projects to an audience of scholars, parents, and community leaders. And this year, something unprecedented was happening. A petition had circulated among the students, demanding that Hazel Whittaker be allowed to present alongside them, not as a janitor, but as a mathematician. At first, Principal Emerson had been hesitant, knowing the storm it would stir among certain parents and board members. But the student body had spoken with a clarity that could not be ignored. Hazel's name had been written, again and again, in bold, determined ink. Now, standing at the threshold of room 108, Hazel found herself grappling with a fear far greater than public speaking. It was the fear of stepping fully into the light. She had spent so long building a life in the shadows that the thought of standing in front of the entire community, of claiming the space she had been denied for so many years, felt almost too big, too raw. Inside the classroom, Mr. Sloan was adjusting a projector. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, a genuine smile that held no trace of the man he once had been. "They've scheduled you first," he said, his voice gruff but kind. Opening speaker. Hazel blinked. "First," she echoed, her heart pounding. He chuckled, sensing her nerves. "You deserve it," he said simply. "And, if you need anything, Hazel, I'm here." Hazel nodded, unable to trust her voice. For weeks, she prepared, poring over old notebooks, brushing the dust off forgotten theories that once lived vibrantly in her mind. In the evenings, long after the final bell had rung, she sat at a small table in the janitor's closet, working out equations by hand under the dim glow of a single fluorescent light. The night before the symposium, Hazel walked through the empty school one last time. Each hallway whispered memories of judgmental stares, cruel laughter, and silent endurance. But now, those memories were layered with something new: respect, hope, change. She paused in front of room 108, resting her hand lightly on the doorframe. Tomorrow, she thought, I will tell my story not for myself, but for every person who was ever told they weren't enough. For every dream smothered by silence. And for the first time in a very, very long while, Hazel Whittaker did not feel afraid. She felt ready. The morning of the Winter Symposium dawned bright and sharp, the sky painted in hues of silver and blue. Hazel stood backstage, clutching a worn leather-bound notebook to her chest. Around her, students bustled, nervous, excited, whispering last-minute revisions to their presentations. Yet when they passed Hazel, their chatter softened. Some offered her reassuring smiles. Others simply nodded, an unspoken acknowledgement of the moment's gravity. From the main hall, a murmur of hundreds gathered, parents, educators, scholars, and even local news reporters, all filling the seats in anticipation. Principal Emerson adjusted the microphone at the podium. His voice, steady and clear, echoed through the auditorium. Today, he began, we celebrate not only academic excellence, but also resilience, courage, and the profound truth that brilliance can reside in places we least expect. He paused, scanning the room. Our first speaker embodies these ideals more than anyone I've ever had the privilege to know. Hazel heard her name called. She took a breath so deep it felt like she was drawing courage from the very bones of the old building. As she stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. She walked slowly, purposefully, her heart pounding, but her head held high. The lights overhead blinded her momentarily, but as her vision cleared, she saw them, rows upon rows of faces, leaning forward, expectant, open. Hazel placed her notebook on the podium, her hands trembling slightly. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, she began. "I am Hazel Whittaker," she said, her voice low but firm. "Some of you know me as the woman who sweeps your hallways, who empties your trash cans, who mops the mud from your shoes in the wintertime." Soft laughter rippled through the audience, not mocking, but warm. Hazel continued. "What you may not know is that I once had a different dream. A dream of numbers and possibilities. A dream of becoming a mathematician." A deep, profound stillness settled over the crowd. Hazel opened her notebook, revealing pages filled with intricate equations and elegant proofs, written in her careful hand. She spoke not of bitterness or blame, but of wonder, the wonder she had always found in the symmetry of numbers, the beauty of problem-solving, the silent poetry of logic. She walked them through a mathematical concept, simple at first, then unfolding into something breathtakingly complex, like a flower blooming in fast forward. With every word, every graceful movement of her hand across the board, Hazel dismantled the prejudices that had kept her hidden for so long. By the time she solved the final theorem and set down the chalk, the audience was silent, not because they were confused, but because they were in awe. Hazel closed her notebook softly. "I do not stand here today seeking recognition," she said. "I stand here to remind us all, talent knows no color. Genius knows no occupation. Worth knows no title." She looked out at the sea of faces, meeting the gaze of each one, as if daring them to deny what they had just seen. And most importantly, she finished, her voice clear and steady, "Respect is not something to be granted sparingly. It is a right that belongs to us all." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the auditorium erupted, not into polite applause, but into a standing ovation so thunderous it shook the floor beneath her feet. Hazel stood there for a long moment, bathed in the light of respect she had so long been denied, her heart swelling with something she had not allowed herself to feel for years. Pride. Belonging. Victory. When Hazel finally stepped off the stage, her knees trembling slightly from the adrenaline, she was met not with the quiet solitude she was used to, but with a tide of students, teachers, and even parents surging toward her. Some simply touched her hand in silent gratitude. Others wiped away tears openly, unashamed. Principal Emerson found her first, his face flushed with emotion. "Ms. Whittaker," he said, almost choking on the words, "I owe you an apology, and so much more." Hazel offered him a small smile, one filled not with bitterness, but with grace. "You owe me nothing but honesty," she replied softly. "And maybe, a promise to look closer at the hearts behind the faces." Emerson nodded solemnly, as if taking an unspoken oath. Just behind him, a group of students gathered awkwardly, boys and girls who, only weeks ago, had laughed at her or ignored her completely. A tall boy with tousled hair, who Hazel recognized from Mr. Anderson's calculus class, stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Was wrong," he stammered, his cheeks burning. "We were wrong. You taught us something none of us deserved to learn so easily." Hazel looked at him carefully, then at the others, her gaze softening. "Understanding," she said gently, "is not something to be given or taken lightly. You earned it today, by listening." Another boy, younger, clutched a worn copy of a calculus textbook to his chest. "Will you teach us?" he asked, his voice so small it barely rose above the murmur of the crowd. For a moment, Hazel's heart caught in her throat. 30 years ago, she had walked away from a dream that had felt crushed beneath the weight of prejudice and despair. She had accepted that teaching was not meant for her. And yet, here she stood, being offered that dream again, not with a formal title, not with a fancy degree, but with something infinitely more valuable. Trust. Respect. Hope. Hazel smiled, truly smiled, and nodded. "I would be honored," she said. The students cheered, a pure, unforced sound that rang through the great hall. In the following weeks, a quiet revolution began at Westbridge High. Hazel stayed on as a janitor by her own choice. She continued to mop the floors, empty the trash cans, and polish the windows. But twice a week, she also held informal math sessions in the library after school. At first, only a handful of students came, sitting awkwardly on the carpeted floor as Hazel patiently walked them through complex concepts. But word spread. Within a month, dozens were attending, students who had once feared math, students who had once mocked her, students who simply wanted to learn from the woman who had taught them the most important lesson of their lives. Never judge a mind by its uniform. Hazel's old, worn notebook became a sacred object among the students, its pages filled with beautiful, complicated formulas and handwritten notes in careful cursive. It wasn't long before the local news caught wind of the story. A quiet genius. A janitor turned mentor. A school transformed. Hazel declined every interview. She didn't need or want fame. The real reward was watching the light ignite behind the eyes of her students, the way it once had behind hers, long ago. The library at Westbridge became a second home for Hazel, and not just because of the math lessons. It became a refuge, a place where curiosity was more important than appearances, where understanding mattered more than status. Hazel had never expected to become a symbol. And yet, slowly, subtly, she did. Students who had once shuffled past her without a glance now stopped in the halls just to say hello. Teachers who had once regarded her with detached politeness now asked her real questions, sometimes about math, sometimes about life. There was an unspoken agreement spreading through the school: respect was no longer optional. One crisp November afternoon, as golden leaves carpeted the school courtyard, Hazel sat cross-legged on the library floor, a small circle of students gathered around her. They were working through a particularly difficult problem on a whiteboard propped against the wall. "You see," Hazel explained, her voice warm and steady, "a solution isn't always obvious at first. Sometimes, you have to step back. Look again. Try a new path." The metaphor hung there between them, more powerful than any chalked formula. Among the students sat Noah Reynolds, the same boy who had once whispered cruel jokes under his breath when she passed. Now, he leaned forward eagerly, his pencil tapping anxiously against his notebook. "I think I see it," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You have to work backward first." Hazel beamed. "Exactly," she said. "Sometimes the best way forward is to retrace where you've been." The room fell into a contented rhythm, pencils scratching, murmured discussions rising and falling. Hazel glanced up and caught sight of Mr. Anderson, standing awkwardly just inside the doorway. He hadn't come closer. He hadn't said a word. But his eyes, those proud, guarded eyes, were softer now. Full of something like awe, and shame, and gratitude. Hazel nodded to him gently, an invitation without expectation. Slowly, hesitantly, Anderson stepped forward and took a seat at the back of the group, folding his tall frame down among the students. No one said anything. No one needed to. In that moment, Hazel knew. Healing didn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it came in small, almost invisible acts of humility. And sometimes, the greatest lessons were taught without a single word. Days passed, then weeks, but the atmosphere at Westbridge never returned to what it had once been. It didn't feel like a revolution. There were no banners, no grand proclamations. Instead, it was something gentler, almost imperceptible. A slower pace when students passed Hazel in the hallway. A softness in the greetings from teachers. A genuine attentiveness when she spoke. Respect had seeped into the walls of Westbridge, quiet and profound. One early December morning, when frost still glittered on the grass, Principal Whitmore approached Hazel in the hallway. He held a small, official-looking envelope in his hand, his face a careful mixture of formality and warmth. "Miss Dawson," he said, clearing his throat. "We, the faculty, would like to formally recognize your contribution to Westbridge." Hazel blinked, stunned. She had spent a lifetime in the shadows, expecting nothing, asking for even less. Whitmore continued, his voice firm but kind. "You've reminded us of the dignity inherent in every person. You've taught not just mathematics, but humility, perseverance, and grace. We'd be honored if you would allow us to present you with the inaugural Westbridge Beacon Award at the Winter Assembly." Hazel's throat tightened. Awards were for others, the loud ones, the shiny ones, the ones born into privilege. Not for janitors. Not for invisible women. And yet, the sincerity in Whitmore's eyes was undeniable. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was, at last, real recognition. Hazel smiled softly, her heart swelling with an emotion too big to name. "I would be honored," she whispered. And as Whitmore handed her the envelope, heavy with embossed paper and the weight of a long overdue respect, Hazel felt the world shift just a little more towards something better. Not perfect. But better. In the weeks that followed, preparations for the Winter Assembly swept through Westbridge. For the first time in decades, Hazel found herself at the center of something, and it wasn't ridicule. It was admiration. Students decorated the auditorium with hand-drawn posters celebrating not just academic achievements, but character, courage, and kindness. In one corner, someone had drawn a simple figure, a woman holding a mop in one hand, a piece of chalk in the other, standing proudly between two worlds. Hazel smiled when she saw it. It was imperfect. It was beautiful. It was, in its small way, a revolution. The day of the Winter Assembly arrived, dressed in muted sunlight and the crisp chill of a coming snow. Students filed into the auditorium, their breath misting faintly in the cold air, their chatter a low hum of anticipation. Hazel stood quietly backstage, wearing the plain navy dress she reserved for church Sundays and rare family gatherings. She clutched the program booklet in her calloused hands, feeling the paper tremble slightly with her own heartbeat. She wasn't nervous about speaking. She wasn't even afraid of the eyes that would soon turn toward her. What weighed on Hazel's chest was something deeper. The quiet realization that she was no longer invisible. The life she had lived in the margins was being called to the center. For a moment, she thought of her father's worn hands, guiding her pencil over yellowed notebooks as a child. She thought of her mother's whispered prayers behind thin apartment walls, asking for a better life for her daughter. They had not lived to see this moment. But Hazel would carry them onto that stage with her, stitched into every fiber of her being. The ceremony began with typical fanfare. Honor roll students beamed under the bright stage lights. The orchestra played a hopeful medley of winter songs. Then, Principal Whitmore approached the podium. There was a weight to his steps, a solemnity that made even the fidgety freshmen sit a little straighter. "This year," Whitmore began, his voice carrying warmly through the auditorium, "we inaugurate a new tradition. A recognition not merely of achievement, but of character." He paused, letting the words settle. "Today, we honor a woman who reminds us that true greatness often wears humble shoes. A woman whose wisdom and strength have quietly reshaped this school's heart." A ripple went through the audience. Heads turned toward the backstage curtains. Hazel closed her eyes for a brief, steadying breath. Then she stepped forward. The light hit her first, bright and unflinching, but Hazel didn't flinch. She walked calmly, her every step deliberate, until she stood at the center of the stage. The applause began as a tentative patter, polite and proper. But then, almost imperceptibly, it grew. Swelling. Rising. Until it filled the room with a sound so thunderous, Hazel felt it vibrating in her very bones. The students who once looked through her now stood, clapping with such earnestness that tears stung Hazel's eyes. She saw Mr. Whitmore smiling proudly, Miss Franklin nodding with tears in her own, and even Mr. Carlyle, standing awkwardly but clapping nonetheless. Hazel took the microphone with steady hands. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. She spoke not with grandeur, not with flowery speeches, but with the same quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of storms. "I never expected to be standing here," Hazel said simply. Her voice was low but firm, each word falling like a stone into a still pond, rippling outward. "I have spent much of my life unseen. Not because I wanted to be invisible, but because the world sometimes looks with eyes clouded by assumptions." A hush fell over the auditorium. "And yet," Hazel continued, a small, gentle smile touching her lips, "in every hallway I cleaned, every piece of trash I picked up, I carried with me a love for learning, a belief in dignity, and a quiet hope that one day, we would all see each other a little more clearly." Her gaze swept the room. Not one pair of eyes turned away. "Respect," she said, her voice thickening slightly, "is not a gift we give to some and withhold from others. It is a basic truth we owe each other." She stepped back, allowing her words to linger in the charged silence. Then she gave a small, graceful nod and walked off the stage. The applause that followed her was not just for solving an equation. It was for enduring. It was for hoping. It was for standing in the light after decades of shadow. Hazel Dawson had finally stepped into her rightful place, not because the world had changed, but because she had never allowed it to change her. She had simply waited, patiently and quietly, until the world caught up. The days that followed the assembly seemed to unfold in a kind of soft, golden light. Not because the weather had changed, it remained cold and gray, the air thick with the promise of snow. But because something unseen had shifted inside Jefferson High. Where once Hazel moved through the hallways like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarked, she now found herself met with nods, smiles, and genuine greetings. "Good morning, Mrs. Dawson," a junior boy said one day, holding the door open for her as she entered the math wing. "Thank you for everything you've done," whispered a shy girl as Hazel polished the trophy cases near the library. Teachers paused to chat with her, not out of obligation, but out of an awakened curiosity, an eagerness to know the woman they had so long overlooked. Hazel responded with her usual quiet grace, but inside, she marveled at the change. Not because she craved attention, she had long since learned to live without it, but because the air itself seemed lighter now, more breathable. People were beginning to see each other properly. And not just her. She noticed the way students now hesitated before mocking a struggling classmate. The way teachers leaned in to listen when quieter voices spoke. Small things, yes. But small things had a way of growing. One afternoon, as Hazel dusted the windowsills in the principal's office, Mr. Whitmore called her over. "Hazel," he said, motioning toward a worn leather chair across from his desk. "Would you mind sitting down for a moment?" She hesitated, unsure if she was being summoned for some new responsibility. But Whitmore's face was open, kind, devoid of any official stiffness. "I wanted to show you something," he said, turning a folder toward her. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters, some neatly penned, others messy and hurried, but all brimming with sincerity. Students. Parents. Teachers. All writing to say thank you. Thank you for reminding us that brilliance wears many faces. Thank you for teaching us about dignity. Thank you for changing our hearts. Hazel blinked hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. "I thought you should know," Whitmore said gently. "The impact you've made here, it's real. And it's lasting." Hazel looked down at the letters, tracing her finger over the words as if trying to absorb their warmth. She did not speak, words felt too small, too clumsy. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against the pages, closed her eyes for a moment, and simply breathed it in. Later that evening, as she walked home under a sky bruised with winter twilight, Hazel thought about all the roads she had traveled to reach this point, the dreams abandoned, the humiliations endured, the small victories won in silence. She thought of the nights she had cried quietly into her pillow, wondering if she would ever be anything more than a name on a janitorial schedule. And she realized something simple but profound. She had never needed anyone else's permission to matter. Her worth had been there all along, steady, resilient, unbreakable. She smiled to herself, the kind of small, secret smile that warmed from the inside out. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, their sound weaving through the cold air like a hymn. Hazel pulled her coat tighter around her and kept walking, her steps light, her heart even lighter. In the deepening night, she carried with her a truth that could never again be taken away. She had claimed her own space in the world. Not by demanding it. Not by fighting for recognition. But by standing in her quiet genius, unwavering and true. And somehow, against all odds, the world had finally learned how to see her. Winter eventually loosened its grip on the town, yielding to the cautious blush of spring. At Jefferson High, daffodils sprouted alongside the brick walls, their stubborn brightness a quiet symbol of resilience. Hazel Dawson moved through the school with her usual steady rhythm, wiping windows, sweeping stairwells, tidying forgotten corners. But the air around her had changed forever. She was no longer invisible. No longer just the janitor. She was a reminder. A living testament to strength, humility, and the quiet, breathtaking power of perseverance. And perhaps most importantly, she had become something rarer still in the world of teenagers, a role model. Students whispered about her the way one might whisper about a hero, not with pity, not with detached admiration, but with genuine awe and gratitude. One afternoon, a group of seniors approached her near the trophy case. "Mrs. Dawson," a boy named Marcus began, his voice cracking slightly, "we were wondering if you'd do us the honor of being the keynote speaker at our graduation ceremony." Hazel blinked, stunned. She set down her cleaning cloth and looked at the hopeful faces before her, young, earnest, brimming with the kind of potential she had once carried quietly within herself. She faltered, smiling. "I'm not sure I'd know what to say." "You don't have to say anything fancy," a girl chimed in. "Just tell us what you know. Tell us about life." Hazel thought about it that evening as she sat by the small window in her modest home, watching the last light of the day fade into deep velvet. What would she tell them? Not grand lessons. Not complicated theories. But something simple. Something true. When the day of the ceremony arrived, Hazel stood before the sea of graduates in her best pressed blouse and skirt, her hands trembling only slightly. She gazed at the eager faces, at their expectant eyes, and began. "Life," she said quietly, "will not always be fair to you." The room stilled. There will be times when you are overlooked. Dismissed. Misjudged. Not because of who you are, but because of who people think you are. She let the word settle. And in those moments, Hazel continued, her voice strengthening, you will have a choice. To shrink, to fade away. Or to stand taller, even when no one seems to notice. She paused, searching for their eyes. You are not your job title. You are not your clothes, or your address, or the assumptions others make about you. You are your character. You are your perseverance. You are the dreams you refuse to give up, even when the world tells you to. Her words carried across the auditorium like the clearest, purest bell. "And if you remember that," she said, a small smile breaking across her face, "you will be unstoppable." There was silence at first, a sacred, reverent hush. Then, slowly, it began. One person stood. Then another. And another. Until the entire room was on its feet, roaring with applause, with gratitude, with awe. Hazel Dawson, the quiet janitor once overlooked by so many, had become the soul of Jefferson High School. As she stepped down from the podium, the students surged toward her, not with the casual indifference she had once known, but with open arms and shining eyes. That evening, as Hazel walked home beneath a sky smeared in gold and lavender, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Not the peace that comes from being admired, but the peace that comes from knowing you stayed true to yourself, through storms, through injustice, through loneliness. A few blocks from her house, she paused and looked up at the vast, star-scattered sky. She thought of all the people still walking through the world unseen, carrying brilliance inside them like hidden lanterns. And she sent a silent wish upward. May they find the courage to shine. Because Hazel Dawson knew now, more deeply than ever, that when even one person refuses to fade into the margins, the entire world grows a little brighter.